Emily walked with her head down, clutching a plastic container filled with leftovers from the diner where she worked. The Chicago night air was sharp and unforgiving, her thin coat no match for the cold wind that whipped down the empty streets. Her sneakers were worn flat, her shoulders stooped from exhaustion, but she kept walking because she had no choice. Home wasn't really a home, it was a rundown shelter at the edge of the city where she and her younger brother tried to make a life out of nothing. She was only 21, but hardship had carved lines into her face that made her look older. Once, she had dreamed of college, of independence, of a life filled with possibility. But those dreams died when her mother passed away and her father walked out, leaving Emily to raise her 13-year-old brother alone. Since then, survival had been the only goal. She worked long shifts at the diner, scrubbing floors, bussing tables, and begging for extra hours. Tips were scarce, wages barely enough to cover rent, and most nights, she carried home the only food she and her brother would eat, scraps packed into plastic takeout containers. What Emily didn't know was that tonight, carrying those leftovers through the freezing streets, her life was about to change forever. Across town, Richard Hale, a 45-year-old CEO known for his precision and discipline, was driving home with his son, Michael. Richard was wealthy, respected, a man who always had a plan. But his life wasn't untouched by loss. His wife had died years earlier, leaving him to raise Michael alone. The boy, now 10, carried a quiet gentleness that sometimes made Richard wonder if his son had inherited more of his late mother's heart than his own. As their black SUV rolled through the dimly lit streets, Richard was preoccupied with thoughts of an upcoming board meeting. Michael, however, was staring out the window, his breath fogging up the glass. Suddenly, he leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Dad, it's her." Richard blinked, glancing at his son. "Who?" "The girl," Michael whispered, eyes wide. "The one from the diner. She gave me pie last week when I didn't have enough money. That's her." Richard slowed the car, following his son's gaze. On the sidewalk ahead was a young woman walking slowly, shoulders hunched against the cold, clutching a container to her chest as if it were treasure. Her thin frame and determined steps stirred something Richard couldn't quite name. Emily didn't notice the car following her. She turned down a side alley and disappeared into the shadows. Against his usual instincts, the instincts of a man who lived by calculated decisions, Richard pulled over. Something about his son's voice, the urgency in it, made him act differently this time. He and Michael stepped out, their footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement as they followed. At the end of the alley, Richard froze. What they found wasn't a home, but a makeshift shelter of cardboard and old blankets tucked against a broken fence. A boy, no older than 13, was waiting there. His eyes lit up at the sight of the food, grabbing it with desperate hunger. Emily sank down beside him, exhaustion etched into her face, but she smiled faintly at her brother as if trying to make the world seem less cruel than it was. Richard stood there, stunned. He had expected hardship, maybe poverty, but not this. Not children surviving alone in silence, hidden from the world. Michael tugged at his father's coat, whispering with quiet urgency, "Dad, we have to help her." For Richard, it was a clash between instinct and caution. He was a man of contracts, not charity. He had spent years keeping emotion at arm's length. But Michael's words pierced through that armor, and in his mind, he heard his late wife's voice, reminding him that wealth meant nothing if it never touched another soul. That night, Richard stepped forward. Emily looked up, startled, pulling her brother closer, her eyes wary and proud. She wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially men in expensive coats. Richard's voice was steady, though softer than usual. "You helped my son once," he said. "Now let me help you." Emily shook her head immediately, pride flaring inside her. She had endured too much to accept pity. But before she could protest again, Michael walked past his father and held out his hand to Emily's brother. Something unspoken passed between the two boys, an understanding that only children seemed to share. And in that fragile moment, Emily realized that accepting help wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was strength. The weeks that followed reshaped everything. Richard arranged for Emily and her brother to move into a safe apartment, far from the bitter streets. He enrolled her brother back into school and offered Emily a steady job at his company, not out of charity, but in the cafeteria, where she could work with dignity and stability. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. For the first time in years, Emily could see the possibility of a future. Still, the adjustment wasn't easy. Emily carried the weight of her past, the memories of hunger, cold, and nights spent wondering if she had failed her brother. At night, she cried quietly, replaying her mother's words about holding on through storms. She worried about owing too much, about whether she was strong enough to rebuild. But each time doubt crept in, Michael's smile reminded her of that night in the alley when he had whispered, "Dad, it's her." Her brother thrived. He wore clean clothes, carried books to school, and spoke with excitement about his dream of becoming an engineer. Emily herself enrolled in evening classes, determined to finish the education she had once abandoned. Her hands, roughened from years of labor, now held pens and textbooks again. And Richard, though he had begun this out of obligation, found himself changed too. In Emily's resilience, he saw his own pain mirrored back. He had lost a wife. She had lost her parents. Both had been forced into roles they never asked for: protector, provider, survivor. In helping her, he found pieces of himself he hadn't realized were missing. On a bright spring morning 2 months later, Emily stood in the company cafeteria, serving food with quiet dignity. Gone were the nights of carrying scraps in plastic containers. Across the room, she spotted Richard and Michael arriving. Her brother ran to greet them, laughing, his face open and free in a way it hadn't been in years. Emily paused, her eyes filling with gratitude. She had carried leftovers once, nothing but scraps. Now she carried hope, and all of it had begun because a little boy had looked out of a car window and recognized kindness when he saw it. Life doesn't often give second chances, but sometimes one act of compassion, a slice of pie, a child's voice saying, "Dad, it's her," can stitch broken lives back together. Emily never forgot the hunger, the cold, the despair. But she also never forgot the night when someone finally saw her, not as a shadow on the street, but as a soul worth saving.